Hi and welcome. I'm Lynn Langit. In this part 5 of my 6-part screencast series using Google's Cloud for Developers, we're going to take a look at programming some of the Google Cloud APIs using Java. A bit about me, if you haven't listened to any of these screencasts, in particular, I'm a Google Cloud developer expert recognized by Google for my community technical education work this last year and the year before. So this is part 5 in the middle of a 6-part total series, which is designed to get developers started working with the Google Cloud. This one, of course, is going to have a lot of code samples, so these will be up on GitHub, and I'll overlay the URL to GitHub so you can get them there, and the code samples will be in Java. So we're going to go ahead and get started taking a look at a couple of the Google Cloud APIs programming with Java. It's a good practice while programming to understand not only the names of the APIs that are available, but also the versions. So this page that I took a screenshot of is one that I use just to check the most recent versions to make sure that I'm programming against them and I have the proper tools. So it's developers.google.com whack APIs-explorer. In addition to the previous reference, another reference that I'll often use before I open Eclipse is the Google Developers OAuth 2.0 Playground. And I'm going to demonstrate this because I commonly use it when I start working with really any of the cloud services, or if anything moves from a preview to a general availability. And I just check here first to see what has changed in the API. So it's a useful playground or a practice area before you start programming in a development environment. And before we go over there, I just want to talk a bit about the authentication concept called a scope, because you're going to be working with this quite a lot when you're programming the APIs. And I just show here a screen from the OAuth tool with the BigQuery API as an example. And you can see if you look at the screenshot that the various levels of authentication that you have available are around BigQuery, around dev storage, and around the cloud platform. So we're going to go ahead and start looking at the APIs, not in Eclipse, but we're going to look at this OAuth 2.0 Playground. Now here we are over at the OAuth 2.0 Playground that I talked about, and you can see the URL is developers.google.com whack OAuth Playground. And there are a couple of steps that you have to do here. The first thing is you have to select and authorize your API, which we will do. And then you have to exchange your authorization code for tokens and then configure your request to your API. So let's work with the BigQuery API. And you can see here that we want to authorize BigQuery, and we want to say authorize API. And here's our auth page. We're going to say accept. And what that's going to do is that's going to give us an authorization code, and we're going to need to exchange this for tokens, which we have. And so now we want to construct our request. So if we were familiar, we could just put in our request URI inside of here. But if we were just, exploring the API, we could start by listing possible operations. And this would be probably familiar if you had a chance to look at the previous screencast where I was showing the command line utilities. And you might remember that I mentioned BQ, which I got an update from the team. Needs to be at this point bq.py. And these are some of the options that you would have. So if we wanted to, for example, see some information about data sets, then we would need to send this request here. Now what I've done is I've just completed this using a project that I have data sets in, and I'm just going to paste this in, and this is in the Lynn Langit project, and then I'm just going to send the request. And then you'll see here's the response that I have data sets. I have one called mfeathers, I have one called ABC, I have one called Not Adventure Works, one called ZZZ, and if I go over to my console, and then I open up the BigQuery console, you can see these are the data sets. And just so that you can kind of understand how this works, if I go back and I say select and authorize, for example, if I wanted to work with Compute Engine, I would have to first select the scope, then send the request to get the token, and then construct my request and get my response. So to prepare to program on the Google Cloud in Java, there are a couple of steps. The first thing is you need to download the Google Cloud SDK. Then you are probably going to want to download the Google Cloud plugin for your IDE. I happen to use Eclipse, and there are multiple ones available. You may want other Google Web API tools depending on what kind of application you're building. If you're using the GWT, there are tools for that. Google Web Toolkit, that is. There are also Android tools if you're an Android developer. Also, if you're using Google Cloud SQL, you might want to have the local MySQL client so that you have a console to work with your MySQL instance if that's something that's part of your project. So you want to set up your environment. So when you download the Google Cloud SDK, you select your language as I've shown on the screen. And of course I've selected Java here, and then it shows you which components will be installed. And as of this recording, which is January 2014, the most current version of the SDK is 1.8.8. And you can see that you also get some of the command line tools, the BigQuery command line tool, you get the core SDK tools, you get the Cloud SDK for Java developers, and then you get the Cloud Storage command line tool and the Compute Engine command line tool. Now, in addition to this, the second thing that you're going to want to get is, in our case, the Eclipse plugin, which I've shown you the path here, and you just install it, and then you select the Google App Engine Java SDK 1.88, and then that will make that available for your project. So once you've done this setup, then the steps to start programming are open your IDE, create a new web app project. Now, I realize that not all your projects they might not be Google App Engine projects, but it's a simple way to start, and I'll show you in the demo that you can just start that up and you don't actually have to deploy to App Engine, just an easy way to do it. Then you want to add your particular Google API, so I'm going to work with BigQuery, and I'm going to work with Google Compute Engine. Then you're going to write your code to do whatever you want to do, and then run locally if you want to, and then deploy to your production, which might be Google App Engine or some other type of location. You'll notice on the right here, inside of Eclipse, there is a Google button that is part of the Eclipse plugin, and you can see the options there: new web app project, import App Engine sample apps, import app scripts project, import Google hosted project, GWT compile project, profile using speed tracer, deploy to App Engine, and add Google APIs. So the first and the last couple things are the ones that I'm generally using. So like I said, once you create your new project, then you're going to add Google APIs. So in this first sample, the first thing that I did is I went ahead and I added Google Compute Engine APIs. And this slide might be slightly out of date because the Compute Engine is no longer in beta. It's general availability. So it's V1, I believe. If you do intend to deploy to Google App Engine, there is a local version of it that you can set up, and I'll show you that when I demo the Google App Engine. So it emulates the web server, if you will, but locally. And this is the configuration for that. This is on Run Configurations. Now for BigQuery and Google Compute Engine, I'm just going to put the output out into console. But when we do the App Engine test, it will be run locally, and then I'll deploy it and run it in production. So let's switch over and start looking at the code. Now I'm going to make all this code available on GitHub. I'm not going to sit and type code. I'm just going to go over it with you. So inside of Eclipse, here's my Google button, And if I wanted to create a new web application project, I would go like this and have my project name. And then inside of here, I could say whether or not I wanted to use the GWT, and here's the Google App Engine. And then I can specify if I want to have an app ID or not, and which version of the SDK that I want. Now, once I have that, then inside of a project, what I would then do is I would add Google APIs. And then, for example, if I wanted to add Compute Engine, I just type COM, and you can see there's the V1 for Compute Engine, and then you just add that to your project. So it's really simple. So once you have that, and here I am down into my project for GCE test, and I'm just going to go over the code. So we're in Google Compute Engine, and in Compute Engine I have one instance which is called API test in US Central 1. So there's a bunch of setup that you need to do in the beginning here, but sort of the important parts, once you do the authentication, which I'll come back to, are you just create a compute object, and then you have instances, and then you call your your list against it, and then you list them for the particular project ID in the zone, and then you basically just print them out. So it's a one line of code. So you'll remember that we've had to do this authentication. So I'm going to paste this URL into a browser, and it's saying that the service account is going to want to view my Google Compute Engine resources. So I'm going to say accept. And here it is. You can see that I have my API test, and here's all my good stuff about it. So basically just writing out all the information. You might remember in previous screencasts I talked about this, but part of programming the API is you have to have the appropriate information set up through your project here. So now let's go back and look at the auth, since we did the one line basically to return. The API is really very simple, and that's why I said if you start with the API Explorer, kind of focus on that. It's a good way to get started. The name of the project, the zone, and then some other information that I need to pass this back and forth. And then notice I have a client secret, and then over here I have a client secret included as part of the project. And again, just to give you an idea, that's this one actually right here. So you create a client ID for a native application, and you might remember, so you create a different application type here, and so when you're programming against it, it's for your native application. Well, and suffice it to say that I have 4 different methods here that are around authentication. So again, I don't want to scare you off. It's not as scary as it looks, but basically you have, this is the authorization method, this is the load client secrets method, this is your exchange your code, and then this is your authorization code flow. So I guess the best for you to do would be to pull down the sample. All right, because authentication has been such a niggling problem, without getting too deep into it, just one more little discussion of it. Basically, in this particular example, GCE uses OAuth 2.0. It's token based. OAuth requests have a particular scope, talked about that, and scope, as it's mentioned there, are read-write or read-only. You might also need scope for Google Cloud Storage, depending on how you set up your GCE instance. And GCE supports the creation of service accounts as well. I would say pull down my sample code and review it as a starting point. All right, next one, let's look at the Java API with BigQuery. So in the BigQuery project here, I have actually an asynchronous pattern as well. I have the same authentication coding pattern as I used in the previous example for Google Compute Engine. So I have my authorized method, my load client secrets, exchange code, and Google authorization code flow. So those sort of that same information. The difference, of course, is I'm working with a different API. So here I'm executing my query. So let me open this up so I can show you what that looks like. So you can see you have a query request and you set the query, and then BigQuery jobs.query is your query request, BigQuery service.jobs query, and then your project number and your query info, and then you have your query response, and then you execute. And then here we're just getting the rows, and then we're just outputting the rows. And the query is, we're selecting the top title count from the public data samples. Again, we're going to have to do the same handshake for an API access that wants to view and manage your data in BigQuery. Accept. Automate this process for your production situation. This is a test. And you can see here's the data rows that are output. I executed a query against the public data right there. This is the same thing. All right, so the next thing is we're going to get an introduction to working with App Engine. Now, when I programmed with the APIs, I deliberately started with them because it's very simple and there was no deployment there. So it was really just going from understanding the API to basically the API wrapping it in OAuth so that you could have OAuth in Eclipse rather than using the API Explorer, for example. It's just programmatically adding that. Google App Engine, of course, is websites along with backends or services. So there is this running locally as a local website and also deployment aspect to App Engine. So let's move towards that next. So in this sample for Google App Engine, this is just the hello world, and this is the entry point, the servlet that has the do-get. And to run this, rather than running this as a Java app, as I did with the other two, I'm going to run this one as a web app. And you might remember from the slides that this is going to run on a local development server. So if I copy and paste this, there's the local version, and there's my hello world. So the parts and pieces of working with this are best explored, and I'll go ahead and stop this, by using the samples. Either the samples that you can get when you install, or you can import the various samples that will show you the different aspects of working with Google App Engine. And you might remember from previous screencasts that there's a whole bunch of infrastructure that's already here for you. Things like a task queue, memcache, all kinds of infrastructure so that you can get up and going quickly, and you can just copy the projects into the workspace. Now, in addition to this, when you work with App Engine projects, you have the ability to profile. You can use GWT. You can generate what's called a backend, which is a service, a cloud endpoint client library, new feature, and you can deploy to App Engine. Now, if you want to deploy to App Engine, you might want to look at the settings first. So when you create a new project, you select the version of App Engine, you might remember that, and then you set up the app ID. Now this is set up to Lynn Langit, which of course is this application right here, my very first one. And if you click this, this will take you out to the console, and here's your version. Now when you're ready to deploy to App Engine, you just click right here. Here's the authentication for Eclipse. And ready to deploy and launch in a browser. And there I am running live. And if I drill in to App Engine and I go to the versions, you can see it was deployed 21 seconds ago. So admittedly, that was a very, very quick tour through the mechanics of working with Google App Engine, and really that's the idea. The concept of App Engine is that, you know, platform as a service on Google's cloud, so you can very quickly get up and running with a website that can scale as need be. And I did show you deploying using the Eclipse console. Now, again, a consideration, even though this is a very introductory series, is working with data. And Google actually had a very good presentation that I referenced here. I mentioned this earlier in the series, but now is the time to kind of reiterate it. And there's some coding patterns here that I thought were very well stated. One of the big considerations when you are moving to the cloud is what you're going to do with your data. So the new paradigm is really, rather than just to put everything in relational, which would be Google Cloud Storage, to use a mixture. So you might use Google Cloud Data Store for some parts of your data, Cloud Storage for others, and Memcache for others. Of course, you could also use BigQuery. And to that end, they did a really good presentation. I thought was just simple and easy to understand, so I just included some of their slides here. So here are the coding patterns for the Cloud Data Store. For Cloud SQL, which is just MySQL basically. Just gives you kind of an idea of what it looks like. For Cloud Storage, which is blob stores. And for Memcache. And again, I recommend you watch this presentation. It's very well done. It's referenced in my slides. About an hour. Okay, once you are up and going with your Google App Engine deployment, of course you can create up to 10 projects, 10 apps. And there's a new capability called Push to Deploy through GitHub that I think is in a preview mode. But that is something that a lot of us are going to find useful as well. You can also use your console to view information about your application and manage it. Of course, there are APIs for all this stuff as well as the command line tools. And then there's a new, I don't know if it's new, but it's something I found in working with this called App Stats capability that you can further instrument your application. It requires some changes to the config files though. And you can use your version control here. There's also a command line tool called app config, app CFG, that you can push programmatically. Another thing that I came upon and I wanted to just show you as part of this series is working with this CodeEnvy web-based console. I'm actually doing some more and more work on my Chromebook that I got last year at I/O. I got one of those nice Chromebooks, thank you Google. And I'm wanting to program sometimes on that. So I tried it out and the experience was really pretty positive. So I just wanted to show you guys here what it looks like. So here's the environment. Of course it is a browser based, so it's not as rich as Eclipse, but I have this simple form test project here. And if I say File, New, I can create a new file, or I can do a new project, and notice I've configured this to set up Google App Engine. This is kind of analogous to when I was showing the console tools in part 2 or 3, and I showed some of the console tools that are from RightScale that allow templating to spin up Google Compute Engine instances along with other clouds. It's kind of the same way here because this works with multiple clouds. So Elastic Beanstalk from Amazon, for example, Heroku. But what I've done is I've put in my App Engine credentials and I've created this project here. So it's just an alternative sort of area, and then I can run the application here if I want to. And then it'll create a local version of it, and it's like a little form application. There we go. And you can see there you add it. So this is running locally, and if we wanted to look at the code for this, it's basically, as it says, it's a demo servlet showing basic text search. So this shows using searching. This is a little bit different. Here's the do-get, here's the entry point. So it's kind of an interesting little sample. So because I've already configured this, if I want to update this, I can deploy, just like I did directly from Eclipse, I can deploy from CodeEnvy. And there it's deployed, and there I can go take a look at it. And this is some work that I did earlier. And there's the project, and you can see here's App Engine, and I'll go to the instance, the versions, and that takes me, and you can see I had different versions. 44 seconds ago I just deployed it. This one uses a shared index, so you can actually see how the index works in here. So to me, in working with the Google Cloud Services, once you get sort of the basic mechanics, then a great place to start, because there's so many different patterns and so much of this is known, because this is App Engine's been around in general availability for a while. So patterns around scaling, patterns around using the services, basically they've got code samples for everything. So once you, like I said, you can do the stuff that I showed you, which is set up your development environment and get your basic authentication flow. You can plug in the sample stubs and get productive pretty fast. So to that end, the Google DevRel, or Developer Relations, is putting sample code up on GitHub for the Google Cloud Platform. Now, one aspect of this is most of the code is in Python, unfortunately, but there is some in Java, so it's worth looking at, and there'll be more that they're adding. So this is a good place to look for sample code in addition to samples I'm going to provide you. There's also a Developer Cloud Playground. Again, it has mostly Python samples, but it is there, and this is sort of a fun thing because literally you can just make a copy and then run it, and Google spins up an instance and you can literally run it and see the source code right in the browser and change it. So it's kind of neat. I'd like to see more samples up here, so maybe my screencast will be watched by some Googlers and they'll get inspired. So that is a very, very light introduction to programming with Java. Hopefully I get you over the hump on some of the things that tripped me up in the beginning. The authentication, as you could probably tell, was one of the big ones. So as we wind down in part 6, I will be giving you lots of resources, tips from the real world, some of the things I've learned in deploying some of these APIs into production, and next steps for learning more. So to end this out, I'm going to call once again to help the next generation by teaching kids to program. You can use free courseware from my nonprofit at teachingkidsprogramming.org in Java, Small Basic, or C#. C# is at Pluralsight, and Pluralsight is also the location where I recorded about a year ago now about 5 hours worth of courseware on working with the Google Cloud. So in particular, I have a more extensive courseware around working with App Engine, and that is a subscription-based service, so you would have to sign up for that subscription. They do have trials as well. So as we go along, to learn more, follow me on Twitter at Lynn Langit, or subscribe to my YouTube channel. So happy programming. Have a great evening.